Hello. You're watching Economics in Russian. Today, we're going to talk about what a structural crisis is. The thing is, when we first started our work describing future crisis events in the global economy, I'll remind you our first article, mine together with Oleg Grigoriev, was published in July 2000 in the magazine Expert. It was called Will the U.S. Achieve the Apocalypse? In it, we tried to explain the mechanism of the crisis that lies ahead of us. At the same time, and this is something that needs to be explained clearly and explicitly, we were working from the following logic. Any crisis that has objective circumstances behind it can almost always be postponed or stretched out. But usually it costs him the price for it is his coal. I remember very well when we wrote our first article, because we discussed it for a long time. We started writing it in March of 2000. It took us a long time to write, and then it was published in an unfinished version on one of the very trendy websites at the time. Now, I think it's even been labeled a foreign agent, or something like that. I'm not sure what the term is for websites. But that doesn't matter, because since then the administration has changed so many times that I won't even mention its name, since there's no point. And then, in July, the article was published in Expert magazine. And at that time, we believed, understanding that in the United States, well, the economic situation wasn't great, that the U.S. authorities were primarily interested in reviving the economy. That was, well, a bit naive on our part. You have to understand, again, this was the year 2000. Not even 2 years later, Oleg Grigoriev and I were forced to leave our positions. I left earlier. I resigned in June 1998, while Oleg stayed on for a while longer at the Committee for the Support of Small Business. So, in other words, he left the administration pretty much at the same time as I did. But he stayed on a bit longer as acting head of the Committee for Small Business. But that's not the point. The point is, back then we were operating under the logic that these were just corrupt politicians. The theory of power didn't exist yet. I hadn't written it at that time. That happened later, about 5 to 7 years down the line. And in that situation, we believed that the U.S. authorities would try to minimize economic losses. And in the year 2000, let me remind you, there was an election where Clinton was leaving office because he had already served 2 terms. And in that situation, we started to realize, though only later, that this was a mistake, that when it comes to political events, you can't just think in purely economic terms. And back then, we made a mistake, although it was a pretty natural one. We believed that, after all, the most important thing was the economy. It turned out that the most important thing was actually politics. And as a result, the U.S. monetary authorities, as we wrote in the text, did not allow that crisis to happen in the fall of 2000. They started dragging it out. And, by the way, as a result, we ended up with September 11th, 2001. What is September 11th, 2001? It's a completely typical and unsurprising situation, especially in economic discussions, when it becomes absolutely necessary and unavoidable to point to some specific external event or circumstance in order to adequately explain the negative processes and developments that have recently occurred in the economy. And by the summer of 2001, it was already absolutely clear that things were going were really bad in the economy. And in this situation, the new president, Bush Jr., had to either announce that Clinton was to blame for everything or wait. And then, by the end of the summer of 2001, look for some external reason that supposedly caused all of this to happen. That's why on September 10th, 2001, I wrote that I was expecting some major terrorist attacks that the U.S. would stage against itself. But at that time, I thought that it would happen somewhere else, specifically outside the United States, because I believed that such events were unlikely to occur within the country. I even wrote something like an attack on an American embassy. And at that time, I also wrote that it was quite possible they would pin it on bin Laden, because there was just too much talk about bin Laden in the American press. As I've already mentioned on my Telegram channel and on the Kazan, or U website, there are links to that warning, right? Well, actually, you can find it if you search for a warning about September 11th by Mikhail Kazan. It'll come up as a link to web archives. Because I made that warning on the forum of the Expert magazine, which disappeared after, well, it was up for many years, but then Expert magazine redesigned their website and the entire archive vanished. So, there you have it. This is a completely typical example. Since then, all the complaints against us in general, and against me in particular, have been based on just one thing. You promised a crisis, but it never happened. Well, first of all, it did break out on September 11th and in 2007 to 2008. Now it's going to break out again, and this time much more severely. More severely than in 2008, and even more than in 1930 to 1932. But that's not the point. The point is that every time you postpone a crisis, you inevitably pay for it. And today, the price we pay is the growth of structural distortions in the economy. So now we need to talk about what structural distortions actually are. And I'll start not with the United States. Everything is clear with them, but with Russia. Since Russia is kept within this global dollar system, and since there are structural distortions in the global dollar system, there are also structural distortions in the Russian economy. How do they manifest themselves? What exactly are they? I'll explain the essence of structural distortions in more detail later, but for now, I'll just give you some numbers to make it clear. So, the first figure is the result of the monetary policy of the past 2 years. Construction has dropped sharply. Basically, it's been cut in half. In any stable economy, there is a certain division among sectors. Roughly speaking, this sector takes up this much, that sector takes up that much, and another sector takes up a different share. For example, in the United States, for many years, the share of industry was around 70%, but now it's less than 20%. Why did the structure of the economy change? And again, for now, we're not talking about whether this is good or bad. But there are fundamental sectors that provide what's called the circulation of money. In our country, and actually in many other countries too, construction has always been such a sector. And now, look, over the past 2 years, the share of construction in our current economy has dropped sharply. That is, yes, some buildings are still being completed, but overall, the volume of construction has started to fall dramatically. I've talked a lot with people in construction. Yes, they're laying people off. They're reducing the number of new projects. Even so, their profit margins might not drop much because they're shutting down projects that are either unprofitable or have low profitability. And the projects with high profitability especially those funded by the government, are the ones they keep, but the total volume is dropping significantly. This means that very serious negative processes are starting in the economy when this happens quickly. This is the first structural distortion in our economy. The second structural distortion is even deeper and is also related to construction. The thing is, normally, in any real estate situation, there's a general rule that goes something like this. Any building that's constructed should pay for itself through rent within 10 years. In reality, the annual rent for a given space, whether it's commercial or residential, should, in most cases, typically be about 6 to 8 times less than its total value, generally speaking. Basically, that means if you recoup the construction costs in 8 years, taking into account maintenance and other expenses, it ends up being about 10 years in total. This is a fundamentally important point. In our country, this period is about 3 times longer. In other words, the payback period for a property through rent is 18 to 22 years. This means the structure of the economy is skewed. Something is seriously wrong with it. I won't get into the details right now about what exactly is wrong with our economy. But the combination of these two figures clearly shows that the current structure of the Russian economy we live in is not viable. That is, it can't exist even in the medium term, let alone the long term. How can this situation be changed? What can be done? That's a separate topic, which I won't touch on today. But this is a completely typical scenario. Now let's take a look at what's happening in the United States of America, what structural distortions exist there, and where they came from. And here's where they came from. So, in the book Memories of the Future. By the way, I should mention that I've pretty much finished the second edition. How do they say it? Revised and expanded, significantly expanded, about 1.5 times bigger, if not more. All that's left is to add the pictures and graphs. So, there's a chapter in this book dedicated to mathematical modeling. It explains that, let's imagine you have a patriarchal economy with no credit. The weather doesn't change. Society is more or less stable, and as a result, you get the usual growth associated with the use of natural rent. Grain grows, vegetables and fruits are produced, trees grow. And as a result, the growth rate of such an economy is about 24% per year. Very stable. Now, if you introduce credit into this economy, you'll find with interest that the economy becomes cyclical, periodic. And these cycles are determined by 2 factors. The first is the length of the credit. That is, you can issue loans for an average of 3 years, or 5, or 10. Depending on this, the period of this cyclical economy will change. As cyclical, yes, as specialists in economics like to say. And, accordingly, the second factor is the deviation in the growth rates of this economy from the average indicators that existed when there was no credit. And this deviation depends on the volume of credit. We looked at the models with interest. So, we added just a little bit of credit, right? And then, accordingly, the deviation became larger. We reduced it a little, and the deviation became smaller. You can clearly see this on the graph. Once again, all of this is in the book. Then things got really interesting. We unexpectedly discovered that if the volume of credit is too high, let's say, roughly speaking, about 1.5 times GDP, just as an example, then a curious thing happens. The economic growth rate drops to zero or even into negative territory. And instead of cycles, you end up with a kind of depression. Basically, what happens is that everyone starts paying back their loans and stops investing. So, now here's the question. What exactly happened in the American economy? Here's what happened. Imagine that your economy is cyclical. Once again, the scale of the cycle depends on economic factors. That is, deviations from the average values, including the notorious recession, when growth rates during the cycle dip into negative territory. And the length of the cycle has nothing to do with the election cycle in the United States. And here's the picture. A cyclical downturn has started, but you have an election coming up. And in order not to provoke the public, that is, the voters, a proposal is made. Let's inject a bit of newly issued money into the economy. If we direct this money into some new industries, into some new areas of activity, then in this case there won't be any significant inflation. Well, it might go up a little, but not by much. Then we'll sterilize the excess liquidity in the stock market. But overall, we want this liquidity to be, well, kind of, extra, because it will drive economic growth. Demand will increase. And in the 1980s, after the crisis of the 1970s, the so-called Reaganomics program was about giving people loans to stimulate the IT sector, because loans started being given out for gadgets. As a result, economic growth began. But first, the structure of the economy changed. In other words, the role of the IT sector became greater because it was given money. That's the first thing. Second, money was given to the financial market because all the excess liquidity eventually flowed into this very financial sector. And from the financial sector, for better or worse, since the profitability there is higher, well, it can't be lower than in the economy as a whole, because this emission money is flowing directly there. So actually, inflation in the United States is high, but it's primarily concentrated in the financial sector. It's kind of a strange thing. When prices for goods go up, that's bad. But when stock prices go up, that's considered good. But it turns out that it's not always a good thing. But the most important thing is that the share of credit relative to GDP in the U.S. has increased. And this is completely in line with the model we described. So, how did the monetary authorities act? You have this wave of growth, and it reaches its peak. After that, it should go down. And at that moment, more credit is injected into the economy. The curve turns around and goes up again. Then, accordingly, it reaches a peak again. It should go down again, but more credit is added, and it goes up again. So, on the surface, it looks like a great picture. Everything is going up, but the share of credit relative to the overall economy, relative to GDP, is growing very rapidly. And in this situation, at some point, your growth rate suddenly dropped to zero or even turn negative. Boom. And that's exactly what happened in the United States of America. They tried to fix the situation the same way they did in 2001, except back then they staged a terrorist attack. This time, they staged the COVID. It didn't work. So, once again, they tried to stimulate the economy. Since 2021, inflation has skyrocketed, but the decline kept going. Why? Because the structure of the economy that resulted from all this monetary pumping is completely out of sync with the equilibrium state where money, first of all, moves naturally. In other words, you have an economy that supports a fairly large portion of the population, which basically can't exist without monetary injections. And if you take away those monetary injections, then money from the normal sectors of the economy, which actually generate value, doesn't flow into those sectors. So how are you going to revive industry, which is clearly lacking in the United States? Trump is shouting about this at the top of his lungs. If, first of all, the profitability of the financial sector is many times higher, even if you allocate budget funds, you have no control over construction. What you have is, you're giving money to management. And what does the manager do? He's trained for this, right? And besides, he knows that the returns are higher over there. So what does he do? He hires a consulting company for 0.1% of the budget, which spends a year writing up some reports for him. And during that year, he's playing with the money he has on the stock market, making crazy profits, which he personally gets a cut of. When they tell him, "You've spent all the money," he says, "How did I spend it? I was given 200 million. Look, now there's already 210 million. The only thing is there's no actual project, and there never will be." That's the real problem, of course. And on top of that, there's a whole bunch of complications: cross-border trade, imports, the lack of cheap resources like in Western Europe, and so on and so forth. I'm not even going to talk about all that right now. It's just too complicated. What matters is something else. The structure of your economy is such that if you remove external support, in our case, monetary emission, it starts to automatically shrink certain elements that simply can't function under normal circumstances because they're not profitable. That's the situation we're living in today. There's nothing particularly unusual about this. Stories like this happen often. We've heard about bubbles, but bubbles are just a specific case of structural distortions. Financial bubbles occur, for example, when something like railroad construction in the mid-19th century becomes so profitable that all the money starts flowing into it. Whoops. Yes, everything else comes to a halt. People, they lose their jobs. They lose their purchasing power. The money they earn loses its purchasing power, because there's not enough of it, and as a result, at some point, a crisis hits. This is exactly what's happening today in the United States of America. But the underlying reason there, unlike in single industry structural cases, is that in the United States of America, there is actually a complete mismatch between the entire structure of the economy and the real, truly self-sustaining framework or model that it should have. By the way, I'd like to point out that this is exactly the kind of situation described in classical liberal theory, where the economy is supposed to spontaneously return to a state of equilibrium. In other words, for many decades, they kept it in a state of disequilibrium through monetary emission. And the scale of this disequilibrium kept growing all the time. And today we've reached a situation that's described in that model, yes, in Memories of the Future, which I mentioned, where it's no longer possible to restore economic growth with any kind of stimulus, because the share of credit relative to GDP is just too high. That's it, period. So there are really no secrets here, no subtleties. These are just basic, obvious things. Moreover, I strongly suspect that, individually, all of these are known in classical liberal theory. It's just that people aren't used to talking about them out loud. And, as it happens, no one has ever really put them all together into a single whole. But that's understandable, because this topic was taboo. Our book, Memories of the Future, is actually the first book where this concept is presented in its entirety in a structured way. It needs to be said again. There are a huge number of additional factors that need to be taken into account, and that's why I can't cover everything in just one episode, but the general idea has been described. This is the picture we're in right now. I want to point out that structural crises always develop and take shape slowly. If we look at the situation in Russia, the cause of the crisis here isn't that we have too much credit. No, in fact, we don't have enough credit. We lack an investment component in our money supply. As a result, we start to see a different kind of structural distortion, but it's still structural. What kind of distortion is this? Well, we can see it in the structure of real estate prices, where the value of real estate is several times higher than it should be based on its rental value. The question is, why isn't the rental price increasing then? The reason is quite simple. It's all about the balance of supply and demand. You want to rent out your property, but no one is taking it. Because people rent places for the amount of money they actually have. Apartment prices have been propped up by various financial methods, mortgages, government support, and so on. But rental prices aren't being supported in the same way. That's why we've ended up with this strange situation. And now, accordingly, the only option is some kind of restructuring, not just of the real estate market and construction companies, but of the entire economy as a whole. As a result of this, real estate prices will drop. But don't get too excited, because after the restructuring, the average salary might also go down. And, accordingly, the cost of rent relative to salaries could actually increase. But we don't know what the new equilibrium will look like. One thing can be said for sure. The annual rent for a property will be 6 to 8 times less than the cost of buying that same property. Right now, it's much more advantageous to rent an apartment than to buy one. This is the result of structural distortions in the economy. I've already mentioned the reasons: a completely inadequate monetary policy. But in the West, the main reason is the growth of credit volume relative to GDP. And that's why they're facing a massive restructuring, also connected to the need to write off that volume of credit. As you can imagine, since the entire modern economy relies on credit-supported demand, this means a radical change to the whole economic model. And this is a very important point. This means the destruction. I've already talked about this in one of my previous shows, but I'll repeat it again: the destruction of the mechanism that legitimizes property ownership. The thing is, legitimization involves two things. First, it is absolutely essential to pay taxes, utility bills, and so on. And second, there must be buyers. In other words, you can hardly be considered the full owner of an asset if it's impossible to sell it. For example, let's say you have a house in a remote village. That's an asset. Well, formally, it's a house, yes, real estate, and it's registered in your name. Then the government comes to you and says, "Buddy, you have a house, so you have to pay property tax. You have a plot of land, so you have to pay land tax. Your house is connected to electricity, so you have to pay for electricity." You say, "But I've cut it off." That doesn't matter. We supply electricity to this village based on the logic that everyone living there buys this electricity. So, please, pay up. And if you want to disconnect, you'll have to pay for that too. And so on, and so forth. Because the utility company says, "Well, you guys wanted it, right? We have to maintain a 6-kilometer-long power line." And the people there say, "We don't even need electricity. We'd turn it off if we could, but there are 3 houses with 3 grandmothers, and if we try to cut off the whole power line, then, of course, we'll get in trouble." And so on, and so forth. I just visited that place a few days ago, the place where I went to dig potatoes when I was 17 years old. So, it's been 46 years. Well, maybe I shouldn't have done it, because my memories of that place were radically different from what I actually saw. The only thing that remained was the river. The bridge over the river is different. The old school where we lived is gone. And of course, that field kitchen where we used to cook our food is gone too. The farm is gone as well, the one where the cows would come down the hillside to the river, and so on and so forth. The only thing is, the road used to be mostly dirt, but now it's paved with asphalt. But honestly, when I realize that I haven't been to this place in 46 years, it feels kind of scary. So, that's how it is. This is a real problem that needs to be addressed. And it's a problem for everyone, for us and for them. Moreover, as someone who works specifically in economics, not liberal theory, I can say with complete confidence that if we don't do anything, it will happen on its own anyway. In fact, what happened, let's say, in August of 1998 was exactly the economy's reaction to an attempt to bring it into a completely, well, distorted structural state. And so, the economy spontaneously returned to a state of equilibrium. Something similar is likely to happen to the United States of America. Let's note, by the way, that even the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury has already started to explain that there might be a budget default in July or August. Is it even necessary to explain that this would almost automatically trigger a crash in the financial markets? And the terrifying part is that, as shown by the models we presented in the book, as I presented in the book Memories of the Future, though the models are based on Mikhail Kazin's research, they clearly indicate that no matter how much money, how many dollars, you print, there will be no more economic growth. That's because the structure of the economy is such that most of the money circulates within the financial sector. Well, that's it, right? In other words, we found ourselves in a situation where decisions made for political reasons, decisions to significantly change the structure of the economy, have already, right before our eyes, led to extremely serious consequences. These outcomes, which we are witnessing unfold in real time, are a direct result of those choices, and they highlight just how impactful such politically motivated economic changes can be on society as a whole. What should we do in this situation? Well, for us, of course, these consequences won't be nearly as severe as they will be in the West, provided that we respond appropriately to the current circumstances. At the same time, it's important to understand we are part of a dollar-based economy, so their upheavals will inevitably affect us as well. That's how it is. And, accordingly, we'll kind of have to thank those individuals who kept us in this dollar-based economy for so long. And this is a very important and very interesting point, which is as follows. The thing is, in theory, we could have tried to develop a new economic model with a different structure and started gradually implementing it even before this collapse of the current system. In theory, I suggested this 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and even 8 years ago. Today, it's already clear that this is not going to happen. The reasons for this are not only political, but also ideological. In other words, maybe if there were different people in power, not these rabid liberals, but more rational people, maybe they could have made a more reasonable decision. Well, I don't have any other bosses for you. You're stuck with these ones, to paraphrase a phrase from one of the most prominent statesmen in our history. And for this reason, it needs to be divided into two stages. The first stage is anti-crisis policy within the framework of this structural, spontaneous structural transition, which in the West will inevitably be accompanied by a collapse of the financial markets. And, apparently, that's exactly what Trump is working on. By the way, as I mentioned, a week ago or so, as I said, Musk realized his mistake, that he acted incorrectly, that he broke the rules of power. He didn't break the rules of business, he broke the rules of power. And since his business is very closely tied to power, he backed down because for him, it's absolutely crucial to preserve this business. In the end, of course, he'll lose something, but I think he'll manage to keep most of his empire. And Trump, who, from the perspective of the theory of power, actually won a clear victory in this dispute, found the strength not to point fingers and not to shout, "See, I told you he was an idiot." Once again, Musk is not an idiot. Musk is simply a person who approached power with the norms and rules of business. And as a result, he got badly burned. I'd like to point out that his PayPal friends, Sachs and Thiel, understood everything and, accordingly, didn't pursue any ambitions. That's why things will go well for them from the start. Well, let me remind you that the capitalization of Thiel's Palantir grew significantly during Trump's rise to power and actually peaked somewhere around the beginning of February, then dropped a bit, and then rose again. But overall, it's important to understand that the rules of power and the rules of business are very different. Both the rules of the game and the rules of behavior. And then, there's no doubt that Trump is already preparing for this anti-crisis policy. That's exactly why I believe that the much-talked-about conversation between Powell and Trump 2 weeks ago at the White House, there haven't been any leaks from it precisely because, so to speak, they were discussing who would be the next Lehman Brothers. Let me remind you, Lehman Brothers was the bank that was turned into a bad bank in 2008. In other words, all the bad assets were dumped there and it was sunk. Now the question is, who will be sunk this time? Well, basically, who will be blamed? You know, who will take the fall. By the way, it's very interesting. I'm about to say something that's not politically correct from the Russian perspective. We had our own Security Council here, and there are no leaks from it either. In the United States, you can discuss anything. Who does cocaine, who visits prostitutes, who cheats on their wife or husband, and so on and so forth. Who gambles in casinos, blah blah blah, right, who visited Epstein's Island, I almost forgot. Oh, and by the way, I want to say that back when Epstein's Island was thriving, they dragged everyone there. Because it's a very effective way to compromise someone, very convenient. Later on, everyone knew what Epstein's Island was, but in the early days, very few people did. That's why I think there are quite a few people, especially in the early stages, who ended up there without really understanding where they were going. You know, a party is a party. What's the big deal? I'm just getting sidetracked here. So, in the United States, the one thing you absolutely can't talk about is big money. As you can imagine, deciding who will be the new Lehman Brothers, that's about huge sums of money. And in our country, it's kind of like deciding who will be labeled as a bad asset. Over there, it's about where the bad assets will be dumped, but here, it's about who will become the bad asset. Personnel changes. I have a theory that the Security Council was actually discussing personnel decisions. Not in the sense of, we're firing this person right now, but more about how this will be structured as these events unfold. And, I'll say it again, this is just a hypothesis, and not a politically correct one. I admit it, I'm guilty, I'll do better. And most importantly, I honestly have no idea what decisions they actually made there, so no one can accuse me of having insider information. Yeah, I don't have any insider information on this matter. No leaks, that's it. This is a great mystery. But the very fact that there are no leaks is quite telling in itself. For our country, that's something completely unexpected. And, actually, the same goes for the United States. For them, it might even be more unexpected than it is for us. Anyway, getting back to the point. So, the second topic. All right, so here's the thing. There's a crisis. The stock markets have crashed, which means banks started to collapse because the value of collateral assets dropped, loans aren't being repaid, so bad loans were dumped into some banks, while others, accordingly, were bailed out. But the size of the economy drops sharply because of the structural crisis, since the emission support has disappeared. Strong is very strong. So, for those interested, again, in my book, Memories of the Future, I explain in detail the scale of these changes, the downturn that is happening now and that will result from the crisis in Western Europe, the United States of America, and China. But now comes the most interesting part. So, your economy has crashed, right, into a new Great Depression. So what do you do? Back then, in the 1930s, it was clear there were alternative technological zones, and you could go after them and rob them, which is exactly what happened in World War II when two technological zones, the German and the Japanese, were defeated and plundered. And they were plundered primarily, well, their territory and their consumers, so to speak. And actually, they also ended up looting a third zone, the British one, but not completely. But if we look at the current situation, there are no such zones because it's impossible to rob China, and all of China's wealth comes from selling to the US. As soon as your sales to the US dry up, it immediately turns out that there's nothing left to loot in China because the capitalization of Chinese companies plummets rapidly. And then, suddenly, it turns out that for many of them, the cost of maintaining these companies becomes higher than the income they can generate. In other words, they immediately start operating at a loss. And so, the key issue is not about today, but about tomorrow. Once again, I want to emphasize this is already happening this year. Most likely, the main focus is crisis management policy. Yes, we need experts here, people who understand the situation. There aren't many of them, so we need to bring them in and replace those who don't understand what's going on, and so on. I'll say it again, this is more or less routine work for those who make decisions. But what comes next? And that's the most interesting part, for me, as someone who actually works with economic models, development, and so on, this is the most fascinating topic. So, who will be developing this kind of theoretical work, and how? How do you come up with dynamic models? The United States, for example, had a pre-crisis model, which I described in the fall of 2022. I'm not insisting that I'm the only one who came up with it. After all, I was probably the first to publish it, but I don't rule out that someone in the US also presented it, though only in private discussions. So, accordingly, that model was about squeezing China out of the market. But even back then, I said that the latest you could start this was in 2024. That's it. Time is up. And now that's it. Now it's no longer possible to rob China. At least, not within the old model, which would have allowed this structurally distorted setup of the American economy to last for a few more years. But, of course, at the cost of an economic catastrophe in China. And today, accordingly, it's all over. It's already too late. Now everything will collapse at the same time. This is the most interesting point from the perspective of those in charge. It's their moment. It's on them. They will start directly managing the economy and social processes. Well, somewhere they'll even have to shoot, like in Los Angeles. Somewhere they'll have to bring tanks out onto the streets. Somewhere they'll have to accept that a fairly large number of people will die from hunger. Well, it happens. That's just how life is. And from the politician's point of view, well, these are tolerable costs. Of course, they're intolerable from the perspective of those who might become victims. But this is serious, and by now it's almost inevitable. And what's really interesting is what kind of constructive model will emerge that will allow us to get out of the crisis. So, once again, I believe that I still have some potential left. And I believe that this is exactly what needs to be worked on, not just by me, but also by other economists over the next 10 to 15 years. In other words, to come up with new models. It seems to me that this is the most interesting thing one could do. And, well, in conclusion, I want to apologize for the long delay in releasing a new episode, since I was traveling around different cities and towns where the connection wasn't always good. It's one thing to record a 10 or 15-minute commentary on current events, and quite another to do a full hour-long episode of Economics in Russian. Maybe this summer I'll have to skip a few more episodes, but let's hope that I'll try to minimize these occurrences. I hope I was able to explain the problem of the current crisis. Well, that's all the time we have for today. You've been listening to Economics in Russian. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.